The Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium presents Voices of Change, Uncovering Stories of the Western Pennsylvania Disability Movement. The Voices of Change logo is in the shape of an arrow pointing right. Voices of Change, the media history project of the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium, records firsthand accounts of disability history. Randy Gorske of Crawford County and M.J. Bartelmay of Mercer County are disability rights leaders who open doors for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Their leadership is a part of Western Pennsylvania disability history. Interviewer is Mary Hartley. Randy Gorske was executive director of the Arc of Crawford County for 26 years beginning in 1988. He helped many residents of Polk State Center make the move to community living. Photo shows Randy Gorske. M.J. Bartelmay became active with the Arc of Mercer County in 1992 when his son began receiving early intervention services. His advocacy for the rights of people with disabilities included leadership at the local, state, and national level. Photo shows M.J. Bartelmay.
The purpose of the Media History Project of the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium is to record firsthand accounts of disability history. The careers of disability rights advocates Randy Gorske of Crawford County and M.J. Bartelmay of Mercer County are part of that history. Randy Gorske served as the executive director of the Arc of Crawford County in northwestern Pennsylvania for 26 years, from 1988 until his retirement in 2014. His career in disability services began a decade earlier when he was a student at Edinburgh University, earning a bachelor's in social work and a master's in counseling. During college, Gorske worked at a group home operated by the Erie-based Barber Center and was a camp counselor at Camp Corn Planter in McCain County, a wilderness camp for children with learning disabilities. M.J. Bartelmay is the parent of an adult son, also named M.J., who was diagnosed with intellectual disabilities and autism. A longtime advocate for disability rights for his son and others, Bartelmay is past president of the Arc of Mercer County and the Arc of Pennsylvania. Currently, he serves on the board of the Pennsylvania Office of Vocational Rehabilitation and Education Law Center, Pennsylvania, and is an emeritus board member of the Arc of the United States. Bartelmay became involved in disability advocacy when his infant son started early intervention services at the Arc of Mercer County in 1992. Thank you, Randy and MJ.
Thank you.
Randy, you served as executive director of the Arc of Crawford County for 26 years, from 1988 until 2014. Tell us how you came to choose this career.
Well, interestingly, I started the career sort of accidentally, if you will, in that I was an unemployed college student, and somebody knocked on my door one day and said, "Hey, we heard that you are a social work major and might be interested in working for this Camp Corn Planter." I was a umpire for Little League for exactly 2 weeks before I realized that this was not going to be my career choice. So I decided to try it, and I left that day later in the day and visited Camp Corn Planter and became a counselor, and that consumed my summers for three years through college. And so that led me to, in college, really pursue and look at, even though I was a social work major, didn't really know what. One of my professors was very good friends with an awful lot of the staff at the Gertrude Barber Center. And so almost all of my internships that I had to do as projects for that degree were done through the Gertrude Barber Center or an associated type of agency, working with primarily adults. I really never did much with the children at the center, but primarily working with adults in a variety of capacities.
Can you talk a little bit about Coach?
Yeah. So interestingly also, here I am now working in the field of people who have intellectual disabilities and visiting Polk Center, an institution in northwest Pennsylvania, and talking to my grandfather and not really understanding that his brother, whose name was Coach, we all knew in our small town, he swept the floors outside or swept the sidewalk outside the little newsstand inside. He was a fixture there. Everyone knew him. Everyone said, "Hey, Coach, how you doing?" I found out much later that Coach actually, the family decided at the professionals decided, I guess, for them that he should be placed at Polk Center, and they did it. And my grandfather always said is that they didn't like it to begin with, but they were sort of coaxed. They were encouraged that this would be best for Coach. And so Coach spent a few years there. And my grandfather always says it this way: when we thought he was about to die there, because they felt he would die very prematurely, they decided to move him back home into the community. And so unbeknown to me, I'm in the field working and never really knew much about my uncle Coach, who was an adult with intellectual disabilities. Sort of the person everyone in town knew. If you went to the newsstand, you know who Coach was. And the family recommitted. And that was an important part of our family, is that they saw what Coach's life would be outside the family and realized that it was not a good thing for him. And the family realized that and made a concerted effort to bring him back home. And the community was happy, too, to know that this person who was a fixture, no one really understood where he went and why he went away. And so that story never really was told all those years that I was growing up.
If you could talk a little bit, there was a neighborhood girl.
Yeah, so I always say that when I think about disability, and some of my friends remember this time, we were poker playing kids, and so we used to get together at various people's houses to play poker on the weeknights, sometimes weekends. But I remember as a little kid walking down. I lived on Willow Street. It was a very hilly street. Walking down, and I'd get midway down, and there was a girl that would be sitting on her porch in a wheelchair. And now I know what is spastic quadriplegia. Then I didn't know what the heck was happening, but I'd be walking by and she would spasm and I would get scared to death. I probably was 7 or 8 years old. I'd immediately get to the other side of the street and always walk down that side of the street, fearful of that person. When I became a teenager, it happened that one night we decided to play poker at her home with her brother. And so we were gathered in the living room. And before I knew it, this girl had inched up to me with her wheelchair, and she was nonverbal, drooled a little bit, but was happy to be close to somebody. And I just naturally started, I would show her my hand. What do you think? Is this am I going to win this hand? Guys, I got a coach here, a lady. And slowly, and honestly, 1 or 2 times did I ever really interact, because we didn't play poker often at that family's home. But I realized how quickly my fears were allayed by just her coming up to me. And, now I understood a little bit better. And all the years when I was a little kid, I would see them, they'd have to carry her to the car. Just fear, total fear. And so for me, it was the beginning of my realization that, hey, even though I don't know if this is going to be my career or what I want to do, I felt really comfortable with it. And I felt that maybe it was not even hard for me to interact. And so I always think back to that, is that I went from fearful person as a kid to really understanding. And that led me to feel very confident in my career and moving on towards that.
Can you talk a little bit about Camp Corn Planter? Because it's sort of an interesting piece of history in Pennsylvania and New York.
Okay, so Camp Corn Planter. Again, I was given an opportunity. A neighborhood person talked to my guidance counselor and said, Randy Gorske would probably do well as a counselor. And so they visited me and went out, bought a sleeping bag and something, probably clean underwear, I'm not sure, but off to camp I went. And it was a little bit intimidating. These were old civilian Corps cabins, rustic cabins out in the Allegheny National Forest of McCain County. And here, lo and behold, would be 6 cabins, 3 for children, 3 for adults. My first year, I was put with young adults, probably up to age 18, something like that, assistant counselor. And again, our goal was we had programming all through the summer in a rustic wilderness camp, pit toilets, outhouses, showers that weren't necessarily warm. And I think about that. It's amazing any parent sent their child to camp. But that began my really understanding. And it's fearful at times, too. Late at night, you got people climbing over you because we'd put the beds across the doorway so that we wouldn't know if somebody tried to get out. But out in the lobby of that cabin was a little toilet, that you had to empty every morning into the outhouse. So, the night you're sound asleep, someone's crawling over you, you wake up, seeing a lot of people with disabilities who had a lot of different issues, things I didn't understand, a lot of different syndromes that I never had experienced. I learned a ton, but one of the common themes that I found, having worked there 3 summers, everyone who worked there came away with it as being a life-changing event for them in many ways. Some people stayed in the field like I did the rest of my life and continued to do so. Some worked there in the kitchen but have the memories of the people. One of the men who was killed in the shooting here recently was a Camp Corn Planter counselor, regularly came all summer. And immediately on the Camp Corn Planter website that we maintain, people started having, I remember Cecil Rosenthal. I remember Cecil, and the nurse says, I remember the diet Cecil came with. People remembered the individuals, people embraced it. And it's, for me, I was there in 1977, a long time. But people remember all the folks that lived there or came there, all the people that participated. Staff became very good friends, and we continue to get together. We have a scholarship fund in memory of one of the founding families, the Bollinger family. So our Annabelle Bollinger Scholarship Fund is meant to help people in school that's going for a degree related to special education or social work, that type of thing. But the camp, again, I was amazed that Pittsburgh families were very big, sending kids, Buffalo families. 9 weeks we'd be there, and it was, rough sometimes, up and down the hills, woods, bears, deer. It was, you're literally out in the middle of nowhere. Medical emergencies, we had no ambulance, nothing. We would put them in the back of a pickup truck and drive 9 miles through the woods to the nearest hospital. And that happened regularly because we would take, folks that had seizure disorders and other things. So, but from that, it was a hard job in the sense of you worked a lot of hours for very little money, but the most rewarding job probably anybody that ever worked there felt that way about it. And we had people that would travel the world but come back to the summer. They use that as their grounding point, come back, work 9 weeks, then off they would go travel the world again the rest of the year. And so it was really humbling to realize what fun we created, what fun we had. And it was all done, with this idea of it being an outdoor camp, which it truly was,
MJ, you were a longtime volunteer in the Arc at the local, state, and national level. What initially brought you to involvement with the Arc back in 1992?
In August 1992, our oldest son was born. MJ stands for Merton John. It's an old Welsh name. I'm named for my father. I'm MJ Jr. And we had no idea that our son was going to be born with a disability. The day he was born, we discovered he had Down syndrome. As time progressed, we learned about the autism. But we had decided we were going to name him Merton John III, and so he's MJ III. Most people hear me calling him Emmer. But my reaction to things typically is, what do I have to do to fix it? Now, I knew better than I wasn't going to fix Down syndrome. But I worked with a gentleman at a bank holding company who was on the board of a local chapter of the Arc, and they ran the early intervention program, and it was, at that time, still center-based. Now it's done in-home and in the community. I said, I've got to get my son in this. He said, well, you have to go to a base service unit and fill out these forms and determine eligibility and so on. And I said, I don't have time for that. We got to get him in it. So he started at the age of 6 weeks, and later I dotted the I's and crossed the T's. And I was just thrilled. We were watching him thrive and develop, and anyone familiar with autism knows that it tends to set on a little bit later in the development of a child. But I made the fateful comment to one of the staff members, if there's anything I can ever do for you, let me know. And we went to Florida to visit my family. My mom and dad were retired and down there, and came back, and there was a voicemail, "Congratulations, you've been elected to the board of directors." What? So, and back at that time, the ARC chapters were, especially in places like Mercer County and Crawford County and Warren, Forest, they were still family driven, and they were, they might be providers, they might even be very large agencies, but they were run by the families for the family members. And so I got started there, and over time, as I was helping my son navigate through the early intervention system into the school age programs and learning about IEPs, et cetera, I would get asked by other families if I could give them a hand, and I would. And eventually, I became president of that agency, and while I was president of that agency, I was asked to take a position with the Arc of Pennsylvania. The Arc of Pennsylvania was struggling at the time financially, organizationally. They needed an overhaul. They'd been around for close to 60 years and were still functioning the way they were when they were this loose-knit group of families who just cared about our kids because, quite honestly, nobody else did. You know, our only entitlement in Pennsylvania was institutional placement, which was not acceptable for us, and it wasn't acceptable for many. And I think Randy and I will probably talk more about that, but that led me to service at the Arc of Pennsylvania and on the State Task Force for the Right to Education, and which helped and continues to enforce the Park consent decree from 1972 that has led to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act for all kids in the country. And again, because of my efforts, I was also then given a presidential appointment to the board of the Arc of the U.S., where I served for 8 years, treasurer, secretary. And in both the case of the Arc of Pennsylvania and the Arc of the U.S., I think I was brought on as much for some organizational skills as advocacy skills. It came at times that we restructured, developed new bylaws, new financial reporting, and new ways to finance the organizations. And I had some success on it, and it's kept me involved to this day.
Great. Okay, now for both of you, Randy and MJ, the two of you came to know each other through the involvement with the ARC over more than 25 years. What values, beliefs, or affinities do you share?
Well, I think going back to the 90s when I first met Randy, I was at a chapter that there was a Supreme Court decision called the Olmstead decision. I think it was 1999, but it had been in process, and we had already begun to see the effects of the de-institutionalization movement, which was very scary for a lot of families. It meant bringing their children home to what they perceived as a very unsafe place. I knew nothing about the institutions at the time, so one day I'd heard about a monitoring visit up at Polk Center up in Venango County. Had no idea, but I'm the parent of a young guy, and I said, I got to find out what this is about. So I drive up there, and at that, I met Randy that day. I don't know if he remembers it. I just remember being overwhelmed by the whole experience. I did the monitoring visit, and then a few months later, there was a large event in Oil City that I think you might have facilitated with pro-institution people at it, and many state legislators were there. And I remember sitting with my state legislator at the time, because this really was a challenge for people. Should we be doing this? Should we be trying to shut down institutions? How are we going to care for people in the community? The infrastructure isn't there yet. Will the money follow the person out of the institution into the community? So that's where we met, and I realized pretty early on that Randy and I had similar values.
Yeah, I think you referenced a couple of things when you said you want to fix things right away. One of the things that I think we shared is that there was a lot of controversy, a lot of issues, a lot of discussion about things, so sometimes contentious at times, and it's easy to get caught up in that. It's easy to get frustrated by that, but I think MJ and I both felt sort of maybe we're a little more balanced in the approach that, there's a lot to be discussed. There's a lot of processing to be done. Let's not panic right away. And actually, that meeting in Oil City opened my eyes a great deal. Here we had an advocacy movement. We had ARC chapters there, representatives, both board and executive directors, and they were mean to people. I happened to be one of them. I wasn't offended by it, but I remember from Philadelphia, and I blanked on her name all day today, and I'll figure it out eventually, but she came, very well known in the movement, again, was promoting a lot of things. She was actually the facilitator. I was there sort of as the help. But people were, just calling her out, wanting to start things, and she was very calm and collected. And I think MJ and we just kind of sat back, listened, and understood, and realizing that it was fear. There's a lot of fear about change. The legislators were fearful of their job because Venango County, Polk Center was a humongous employer, good, well-paying state jobs, history of it. They did not see what was to be had if you move people out. They saw it as a loss of jobs, and they saw it as their constituents being really angry about it. And I remember, actually, to his credit, he was an interim director at Polk Center. We led a tour at Polk Center, and again, this is how some of the values. And we were talking with the legislators about, and the institutional director who was interim said, wouldn't you want for your family to live in a 3-bedroom home in a community versus living here? And I was like, wow, that was shocking to me that somebody within the system would put it that way. Again, legislators didn't see it that way, but we went to a lot of things together. And I think the value that we shared is that this is all about the son or daughter that we had as a child or the people that we care about. It's all about them. And it took a while for the system to catch up, and not that I was a forward thinker, but I wondered about a lot of these things, and these values were there waiting to be sort of unleashed from me. And I think MJ realized that, and we realized that.
Yeah, I think that's a real good comment. It unleashed a set of values that was in us at the time. And just so you understand, the ARC in Pennsylvania had roughly 40 chapters, and we had about 2,000 nationwide at that time. And this almost tore the ARC movement apart. We had chapters leaving, threatening to leave. We had chapters thrown out of the ARC because of the position they took in support of institutionalization, including the one that I was on target to become president of, and I didn't support institutionalization. But we worked through issues locally. We worked through them with the ARC, and I'm proud to say that there's still a chapter. But it led to a convention in Birmingham, Alabama, probably in 2002 or 2003, where another Pennsylvanian was now the executive director of the Arc of the United States, Steve Eidelman, a name that'll be familiar to many people. And we attacked the whole issue of what does it mean to be an affiliate of the Arc. And the Arc went from over 2,000 chapters to roughly 700 chapters. Some of the chapters aligned with another organization. Some went independent, but it was quite a tumultuous time in the organization. And Randy's right. There were people on both sides that were at times very, very angry with each other. These were executive directors in neighboring counties or and it was difficult. And So there were a few cooler heads among the volunteers and the professionals alike.
So I'll just throw this out there, but one of the things that we've noticed when we've gone up to Polk, but also have had a lot of conversations with them about, were the Friends of Polk. So there was sort of this division in our own Allegheny County and regional area, right? And there was this parents against parents kind of thing happening. And there's sort of like the parents under the Polk umbrella who are very strong amongst themselves, and still in some ways.
Well, the Friends of Polk, if you want me to tell you a little bit about that, because I knew two of the leaders of that organization well. They were from Mercer County and from Lawrence County, the two chapters in Pennsylvania that were threatened with expulsion by the Arc of the U.S. for adopting a pro-institutional bias. And I don't need to mention names, but the one family in Mercer County, I guess the first name's okay, their son David was a wonderful young man, but he occasionally would get violent, and he'd cause physical harm to family members. So Polk was what that family felt was the safest environment for him, not only to protect him from harm, but to protect them from harm. They would go up every weekend. They would take him out on day trips, even overnight, if staff reports indicated that David had been kind of stable, you know, but things would set him off. But by the same token, and I know Randy probably could give you more horror stories. I can remember going up with the mother one time. They called their living units cottages, even though they weren't cottages. They were just sections of this massive building built at the turn of the last century. But in any event, David had fallen out the window of his cottage, they believe, or he was trying to get out, and he wasn't on the first floor. He was on the second floor, and he'd been injured. And I went up, and all the medical care was fine, but Mom was just in a panic. And we had both volunteers and paid staff who would help that family out. Another time, even though the family had full guardianship, which is a whole nother discussion, the dental staff pulled all of David's teeth. And David is now in a group home in Mercer County. The last time I had any contact with anyone was about 2 years ago, and he was in a home by himself, but he had received some great behavioral supports, some communication skills were developed, and anybody who's raised a child like mine can tell you all behavior relates to communication, plain and simple, and I'm sure you know anybody in the field would agree with me. So there were successes, but you know, there were a lot of families like that who thought that was the only safe thing. If you put my son in a group home, he'll get out and he'll wander, and he's going to wander the neighborhood, and he might hurt somebody, and then he's going to be hurt because police will be called or whatever. So they were legitimate fears, but that needed to be addressed, not fought over. The writing was on the wall that the institutional model was not really a humane model. So,
well, one of the interests you mentioned, David, and there are other families. You mentioned Lawrence County. The common thread often was a very difficult person to care for in a home environment, and at that time, the institution still was a preferred method to deal with it. There wasn't really a lot of good behavioral specialists in the community yet. But if you can imagine the families, they're talking to their legislature, an advocate's talking to their legislator, and they're saying two different things. And I remember one time, actually, it was at Polk Center. We had a big forum there, and a lot of the various representatives were there either themselves. I think mainly they're there themselves because the issue of closing institutions was the subject, and there were lots of heated arguments about it. But I remember one of the senators that I respected and knew a little bit, actually out of Mercer County, I said to him, well, what do you actually think about all of this? And he says he just sits back and looks at the professional disagreement. if we can't come together and figure it out ourselves, what do they expect the legislators to do? They're confused, conflicted. They recognize on the right hand that there is an economic loss to the community if they downright close it down. They recognize that it's sort of an unfounded system. The community, it's a big potential, but they don't know. And so the unfortunate part is you had groups playing the legislators, of course. They were trying to promote or advance their theme, and others were saying, no, this is the way it should go. And it went back and forth. I mean, I think one of the things that helped most with that was actually when you had strong leadership from the state government. You had people that were in the positions of deputy secretaries who looked at this issue, and they helped those families. They may have been the one who was contacted by the legislator's office, and they would say, well, let me spend some time and send representatives out. And I remember the fellow from, one of the fellows, actually, he was from Venango County, had son, very large son who beat up his wife, very fearful of what will happen, and they put him at Polk. And I remember vividly at some of these meetings him speaking out against all these plans and being angry. But I also remember the deputy secretary taking him aside and saying, let's talk. And they worked through it. And I believe the last I knew was that they did place him out of the Polk Center into a community-based facility. Again, it had to be specially dealt with. It may not have happened in Venango County, but it had to be within recent distances, because that's the same criticism we had about four families. Is you place your loved one 2 hours away at Polk Center, you have the accessibility is diminished. So a lot of that there was so much disagreement, and there still is today. You still have opposing groups. Actually, I think one of the groups you mentioned about at the national level was the voice of the retarded. And
that's exactly who I meant.
And I think that's important to understand, that there's a group out there that see the people with intellectual disabilities that we're advocating for and working with as merely the retarded. And in some ways, I always thought it's great that they do that, but it just shows in some ways, how ignorant they actually are, that they're promoting something so backwards, so disagreeable. And here we have a movement that is really trying to move beyond that. But they they stirred up a lot of enemy, a lot of legislators heard their voice. Their voice was loud, and it may still be to this day.
It still is loud, and your comment about their name, that is who I was referencing, and that they proudly use a slur as part of their name just astounds me.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things, and you probably remember this too, many of these families, like David's mom and dad, I've sat with them while they cried. We did the best thing we could at the time. There wasn't anything else. And suddenly they felt like, from some of the people who were less reasonable, that they, had just been these horrific parents abusing their child by sending them to Polk. And to a certain degree, and it's a much lesser degree, believe me, I can see the same analogy happening with what we're going through with the sheltered workshop environment right now in the system. A lot of people look at that as, this is a safe place for my child. This is a safe place to not only protect him, but to protect others. And all the fears we're so much more aware of in society today. And but at the end of the day, I think we all know that we were created to live in community. We weren't created to live in isolation, and that's been proven through so many different models, not just the institutional or workshop model in the field that we've been involved in, but I think throughout society we know how that fails. So
Great, thank you. That was really instructive. So Randy and MJ, do you think that chapters of the ARC in rural areas have different advantages and challenges compared to ones that are located in more urban areas? Please elaborate.
Oh, absolutely. I keep a picture on my cell phone of, I don't even own the car anymore, but a horse and buggy tied up beside my Lincoln Continental because I'd come to Pittsburgh and we're talking about, and I'm not going to get too carried away, but new CMS definitions, so on. And I'm always talking about transportation. We have one taxi cab in our county, not company, one taxi cab. We don't have Uber. We don't have Lyft. That's a huge issue. So yeah, but there's also certain advantages as well. I think that, I didn't grow up in a rural area, but we have, 112,000 people in the whole county. And I take my son out in the community and everybody knows him. I'm not MJ Bartelmay anymore. I'm MJ's dad. I'll be in Walmart and somebody I've never have no idea come up and say, "Hi, MJ." And my son's nonverbal, so I have to turn to them and say, "Hi, I'm MJ's dad, and you are?" And I'll hear, "Oh, he used to be in school with me," or whatever. And I think it's great. I love it. It's exactly what you want to have happen. It doesn't matter if your child has a disability or not. You want to see them out, involved, and loved. And I see that all the time. And so yeah, I think. But so we have certainly the small town feel might be a little less hectic and pressured and a little easier. But by the same token, I have to drive to Pittsburgh for dental care and medical care. So I have an 80-mile drive for anything short of, quick check his heart, put the blood pressure cuffs on and make sure we can continue the script or whatever. But, so.
Well, I think you use the taxi story, which is a great story because rural areas lack resources, medical, dental, transportation. And so I think what a lot of the ARC chapters formed is that we have nothing here, but yet we're parents who don't want to send our children away to an institution. Now, what are we going to do? So slowly, like in Meadville, we had a little camp that was at the park just during the summer. Families came together and it's your turn to sit and watch the kids. It's my turn. They created what was called the Blue Barn. It was the first education program in Crawford County. It was still blue and it was still a barn. It was before my time, but I hear the parents talking with pride about the fact that they created something. And I think in a lot of ways, that's the history of the ARC, is families coming together, creating and advocating. But it even gets harder to be able to, to grow your ARC. Money does need to be raised, and there's a lot of ways. For many, many years, we used to do a pie sale, and I'd get hundreds of pies made by moms and dads of the ARC movement, and we'd go out to a shopping mall and sell them. In Pittsburgh or some of the urban areas, they'd have a dinner and raise $100,000, so resources are limited. But I think that's also the rural sentiment, the rural feeling of taking care of their own, that a lot of times we didn't need to have money because we'd take care of our own. And there were a lot of families that knew about the ARC that never took advantage of it, but they knew we were there. And actually, I use this always. A man approached me and said, "Randy, I appreciate that the ARC is there. We don't need you right now, but if we ever feel we do for our daughter, who now is in a life skills program with the ARC, we will approach you. We like what we see." So a lot of times, depending on the age of the child, if they're in school, wasn't needed. But I think that resiliency of, there are a lot of farm families that took care of their own. And I used to go out to farm auction or livestock auctions, not because I wanted to buy cows and goats, although that was fun, because that's where I would find people in the community that I never knew existed. They would be with their families.
I have a friend in Mercer County. We have a substantial Amish population. And Moses' brother-in-law has an intellectual disability, Amish. He's not served by anybody. But Mose will go down to the corner where a community payphone is and call me, and I'll come out and visit periodically. And he allows me to bring his brother-in-law model airplanes because his brother-in-law just will spend hours outside looking to catch an airplane flying by. And I think that's one of the other things that happens in rural areas is there's a lot of folks who, because of a more reclusive nature, and not just Amish, but they don't, they just have a tendency to be self-sufficient, and I'm going to take care of this. And I'm not, I don't, I don't need an agency. I don't want to go talk to somebody from the county, so.
Thank you. So the Supreme Court Olmsted decision came about in 1999. The court ruled that unjustified segregation of people with disabilities in institutions and nursing homes is a violation of Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The decision requires public entities to provide community-based services to individuals who want them. How did the Olmsted decision affect the work at the ARC chapters you were affiliated with?
Well, I think the interesting thing about that is that what we learned very quickly are families that didn't care what the Olmsted decision was all about. They did not want to leave go of institutional care. So if anything, it made us have to work a little bit harder, because now, again, we had to get back to understanding that feeling. I think you referenced a little bit, parents feeling like they weren't a good parent in their kid, that by sending their kid to an institution, never really wanted to focus on why you had your son or daughter go to the institution. We wanted to focus on, hey, look what's available. Look what can happen. Some of those parents embraced that. Again, others, it sort of started somewhat of the infighting, that because we had to discuss it. And but it created opportunity. And I served as personal advocate. I think because I was an ARC person that was visible at the institution, there are people without families. And what I remember is suddenly they're talking about, excuse me, she could live in the community. That before they said she will never live in the community. There was a pressure put forward that we needed to consider, what would it take? How could it happen? And suddenly someone who may have been self-abusive, who nonverbal, that people viewed as unable to leave those walls of Polk Center, were being looked at. Well, you know what? She's 78 years old now, and she probably would do fine in a little group home, if it's especially, got to deal with the behavioral, the self-abuse, some of that issue. But it created an atmosphere where professionals had to ask those questions. And I can say some of the institutional staff didn't want to ask those questions. They didn't want to bring up those subjects, because their feeling was, these people are here for a reason. They can't leave. It's too unsafe, whatever the term was. So it made our job easier, but at the same time more difficult, because now we had to help deal with some of those feelings of, those parents did feel inadequate. Why isn't it fine for my son or daughter to stay here? What does the Supreme Court know? What do you know, Randy Gorske, do you really understand my dilemmas? So I think the Olmsted, actually, up until my retirement, I think we were still talking Olmsted decision at a lot of the ARC meetings, that things weren't moving along quite the way we had expected it to. And so it started a process. It started us thinking differently. And it still required an awful lot of advocacy. I would assume to this day too, MJ.
Yeah, I don't think that's changed. I mean, in Pennsylvania, this year we closed the center, as many people are aware, but we've still got four open, I think, and we've still got a ways to go. But I think that there was some resentment on the parts of parents. They'd started these chapters of the ARC. The ARC movement itself is just over 60 years old. So Olmsted was 20 years ago now. The ADA was 26, 27 years ago, roughly. So, these were the founding members still, who were meeting in church basements and library meeting rooms, wherever they could, supporting each other and caring for their kids, because their kids didn't even have a right to go to school. That right wasn't won until 1972 in Pennsylvania, and it took a while for it to spread. So their only right was to place that child in the institution, and that had to be just a gut-wrenching decision. I just can't even imagine. And we've talked briefly about my son, but my son's nonverbal and can't feed himself and requires pretty much 24 hour a day, 7 day a week care. So, you know, had he been born probably even 10 years earlier, I may not have taken him home. It's just amazing. And one of the other issues I remember, Randy, and you might be able to speak to this better, was we had a huge labor issue. We had these community providers, and to this day, direct service providers are not well-paid jobs. They're minimum wage or slightly more. And the same job back at Polk, I can remember, it might not have been the first time I was up there with you, but it's been a number of years ago, seeing jobs posted for $40,000 with government benefits, you know, that would pay $18,000 and no benefits in the community. And so there was a lot of effort to protect that. And those were also union jobs and with the AFSCME union and civil service. And so Randy had alluded to earlier, this was a tough decision for legislators. So at our local chapters, it had an impact. We had over, I don't remember the exact number, I remember it was in the 50s, families that were members and active in our chapter who there were over 50 individual members, family members in Polk. And suddenly we're talking about pulling your kid out and you know, and I'm a board member sitting in front of these people, and you know, I'm this young guy with a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old kid as this is progressing. And I think there was a lot of, who does he think he is? You know, I've always, you know, I'm college educated, white collar kind of jobs in a rural community that was full of steel workers and farmers. You know, I don't think that necessarily was well received, to be honest with you.
Well, when you attack, and not even attack, but when you question someone's foundational beliefs, like there was a belief that the Polk Center, the institution, would take care of my son or daughter the rest of their life. And now you've got a decision that is sort of throwing that out of the way a little bit. That was a tough one because we celebrated in the advocacy community, if you will, that, hey, the Supreme Court recognized this, and self-advocates who, you know, spent a lot of years talking about their life in an institution who were able to speak about it. Everyone was excited, but then it was the other part of that really was very difficult. And I honestly don't, it may be different in Mercer and Crawford, I don't recall that it changed our life in the sense of anyone coming out. We had already been successfully taking people out of the institution where we could. There were people that were more medically involved and who were behaviorally involved, where the questions then began to be asked. Can they live, and what would it take? And in some cases, the answer wasn't coming back to Crawford. The folks I was at, the individuals I act as an advocate for, actually moved into Pittsburgh because there were more availability of homes to meet their needs. And I was fine with that because, again, the goal was look at, you know, why is she still here at 78? You know, why? But it brought up good feelings and bad, I guess, in my mind. And I really never felt comfortable, like you said, when parents, like, you know, you've dropped the shoe of telling them the institution's no longer going to take care of their child.
I know from our perspective as a board, we really felt a sense of urgency to improve our residential options. And we had run what's now known as life sharing. At the time, we called it family living. We had supportive living, which was, you know, help an individual out in their own apartment with whatever level of care they needed. Sometimes it might only be, you know, a few hours a week to make sure that they're, you know, paying their bills and buying groceries, et cetera. But we developed a couple of, you know, what we referred to as the medical model and behavioral model group home. We did things like, these were still 3 or 4 bedroom homes where everybody had their own bedroom and they were in community neighborhoods, but we'd get ranches and we'd make sure all the doors were 36 inches wide and that we didn't have knobs. We had paddles, and we would install sprinkler systems, and discreetly. We didn't have pipes running along the ceiling. We poured a huge amount of money into some of these homes. When I tell you, we would put 2 times the cost of purchasing the home in renovations, and then we would have awake around the clock staff, and typical group homes would have a time when there would be still staff on site, but they could sleep. And we would even have homes where we would have on-site nurses, whether it was 1 day a week or 7 days a week during the awake hours to help, and nutritionists, etc. So this was a real shock, and in many cases, the funds weren't available. So one of the things that the Arc could do was they could go out and raise funds. We were, because we were family driven. So in Mercer County, we formed a foundation just for that purpose, so that we could generate funds and then take care of those extras that we needed to. And so we had a lot of success, but it's tough. It was tough on everybody.
So, Randy, you had experience at Polk Center as a personal advocate for a few people who were transitioning out, and as a member of the Human Rights and Behavior Committees. What did you observe over those years?
Well, interesting. I always tried to make sure everyone knew Human Rights Committee was an external committee to really look at some of the issues. And if you followed the paper with Polk Center, there were some big issues. Medical care was an issue. There were some doctors that were fired over some medical care issues. I was always proud to say that we knew about them, and the Human Rights Committee minutes were reviewed by the state or federal inspectors. And the interesting part that we didn't go do detective work throughout the facility. It was the fellow employees that also served representing Polk Center that often brought to our attention things like that. And so as one I remember very vividly, we had a psychologist who was very confident, we'll just say. She was very confident about her position. She wasn't threatened. But the medical director said, I'm taking away all of these drugs, and he named them, because they're the highest cost drugs that we utilize in the institution. And there were people who literally had been on Halidol, some of the older meds that are very, very known for being very strong and very difficult to wean people off of. And people were successful on those meds. And I remember that coming to the Human Rights Committee. We were all shocked. We never would have known that, because that was somebody saying this is a violation of, and she had the name of the clients that she felt this would be most counterproductive for. And we went through that. And again, we toiled with certainly, I think we invited the medical director and beat him up a little bit, verbally about the idea, but we were staunch in that made no sense to us, that the cost of a medicine versus the health care of a resident should not ever be taken into consideration if there's any potential issues. But so I came away from that really respecting the institutional staff. Again, you always have somebody that doesn't do their job, but in general, I found that most of the issues that came to Human Rights Committee sometimes came from residents. We always had a resident that served on human rights, but more likely came from some of the staff that were observing things that bothered them. They did not feel was right for that. There are other things that were systems issues. There are people placed at Polk Center because when they were younger, they did something in the community, and it was considered dangerous to the community, although today we'd look at and think of it as being such a minor thing. And they got labeled as somebody that could not return to their community, whether it's sexual predation or violence, whatever. And Human Rights Committee often got faced with that. And again, unfortunately, there are some issues that the state government regs got in the way of people's human rights. And so in some ways, I was happy to be part of that debate, but on other times, I was not always happy that that the outcome was not always what human rights would like. And I don't know to this day if it's still true, but back when I was on human rights, that there was no a male and a female who wanted to have consensual sex was one of the issues. There was a feeling then, or that there's no ability to consent. And I don't know if that's still true this day. So we had great advocates, we had great staff on that. I think we had a pretty good job, and we saw results in the sense that the surveyors would mention. We saw the human rights minutes of March, April, and June referencing someone bringing to bear. And I don't know if you recall this, but one of the issues was that a doctor who was doing stitching up residents without anesthesia, and the one that came to human rights was someone who was total care, had to wear a diaper, and for whatever reason, sometimes the tabs would slash his skin, and it was his penis at one time, and so it's a fairly involved wound, and that doctor stitched him up, and without anesthesia, and again that came to human rights. So the first thing, we have to be fair as fair. To us, it makes no sense. That doctor, I believe, was fired. I think, if I recall.
He was.
But another doctor was implicated in some other issues, ended up suing successfully the state over some issues that, again, there was not a common, the way it's dealt with, there was not a common way. Even though we may look at it from a medical profession, they may say they often stitch up little kids quickly without anesthesia. I don't know if they still do that, but in the old days, because by the time you give them a shot, they're going to squirm and jump around, and boom, boom, you're done. I never bought that argument, but those were the tough decisions that came to human rights. And again, we debate it. And again, we are the advisory, no authority necessarily. So our advice back sometimes was taken, and sometimes it was said, well, thank you for your concern, and we have to follow our own protocol type thing. Behavior management, I learned a lot. One of the families that was part of the Friends of Polk that we referenced earlier, his daughter was a very self-abusive woman that lived at Polk Center, and serving on the behavior management committee, we looked at all restrictive programs, and I would drive down once a week to serve as an outside advocate, listening in. The people would make their, they would explain the program, and then they would be approved by the committee. Despite if I said no, it still was approved because I was outvoted often. But what's significant about that is that family member was so upset with the behavior management committee questioning a program that worked. It was a spray mist program, and if you know about spray mist program, if you're this was self-abuse, so if you go to hit yourself, as you see that, they spray it with some sort of either water. It used to be an obnoxious substance, maybe vinegar. Thinking that would stimulate you to not want to do that. It's behaviorism at its finest. Whether it works or not, I don't know if it ever worked. But that family member he thought that was so important to his daughter that he advocated very strongly, spoke against it ever going away. And the last I knew, and I don't know if his daughter's still alive, that at the time the deputy secretary annually had to give approval to the center to implement that spray mist program because it was controversial and still is. So it goes to show you that sometimes families are like, what's the injury of my daughter, self-inflicting her own injury, is more important to me than them using a behavioral method that may seem noxious to an outsider. So those were the debates, though. Those were strong debates about how do we deal with somebody who's behavioral, because again, mainly it was behavior plans and restrictions that were put into place to protect their own life, and so those were important things. Luckily, we never had to deal with the self-abusive using shock type stuff. That never was utilized in Pennsylvania to my knowledge during my time, and so that would have been a tough one too, because again, that is controversial for sure. But I always felt good though that they allowed me to come in. And you said about who are you? The first thing the doctor in charge asked me is, who am I? Why do I who am I to be on this behavior management committee? And I said, well, I worked at the Gertrude Barber Center, and they accepted that as I had experience. At least I'm not just a yahoo coming in to make trouble, So.
Funny, quick story. We had a new director of curriculum when my son was in school. And I went to my first IEP meeting, and she was the LEA. And a number of people weren't there, but they'd signed the attendance sheet that they were. And I said, what's this? And she said, oh, they've reviewed the plan and they don't have any problem with it. I said, no, they need to be here. She didn't know me. She didn't know that I'd actually helped because I was on the state task force with the new IDEA forms when it was reauthorized a number of years ago. And I put her through the ringer. And at the end of the meeting, she said, are you an attorney? And I said, no, I'm one mad dad. and she became a staunch advocate of my son. But you needed to do that. I mean, Randy, it's almost unbelievable for a lot of people when I share some of this. It was in 2005, 2006 that we were still tearing apart position papers that were shared at the state, national, and local level over things like forced sterilization, to prevent a sex drive, and other things like that to try to give people rights. And it's lack of knowledge and it's fear. And I personally believe the best thing we can do is to bring our children out in the community. They become, even some of the most challenged ones, become the strongest advocates just by seeing them live happily.
Randy, I have a couple more questions for you about your Polk work.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about what it was like to transition people out of Polk, like sort of before and after stories?
Sure. Well, again, the nice part was we're talking about people that at one point I was their advocate they would have somebody to call to report that she hurt herself again. We weren't even talking about transition. And so when the Olmsted did come, that suddenly now our meetings, we're going to talk about whether or not she can transition out of Polk Center, timeline, and how we're going to do that. So that was a totally different conversation. My advocacy went from being, okay, they used to call me, I think every time there was a death at the facility, it was reported to me also. So that I was looked at as being the liaison to the art community. But again, it had to be very purposeful of a transition. And again, we know the term transition, but it's easing someone into it. And so first is, what is it going to take for that person to be successful to leave Polk Center? Now, as MJ mentioned, the cottages, they're usually 16 people in an area. She was getting older, so she's in a retirement area. So I looked around and I'm like, okay, she's with 16 people and a couple of staff. And so when she becomes a need for hitting herself, being self-abusive, we don't know what triggered that, but 15 other people making noises. So smaller has to be better. You start thinking about little things. Smaller has to be better. What little things does make her less likely to hit herself? What things makes her happy? How do you build that into a program that she's going to go to? And actually, that's very easy to do. You just start talking about, people have observed her for years. They know her. And this is, again, several ladies that were up in her age. So we literally just started going from square one, if you will, looking at that. It didn't matter what the address was. She has no family. I'm her advocate. I'm saying it's fine. Whoever offers the best program, that's what we want. And so that became, okay, now we need to figure out. So the word went out through the county of who was interested. I think in her situation, I'm trying to remember if they were taking more than one or two out. So she may have moved in with other people that were already out or not. In other cases, they were trying to move 2 or 3 at a time. But I mean, that took months. That took over a year time period to really address those issues. Once it happened, it happened. And for a while, I kept in contact to find out if there were any issues, mainly any problems. When I stopped hearing about any problems and she was doing fine, I stopped calling, or they stopped calling me, I stopped calling them. So it was a pretty smooth transition, but again, properly prepared, properly thought through, and also the positiveness that now it could happen. Before, almost everyone that I was involved in being taken out of Polk Center at some point, anyone who accompanied him from Polk Center generally said, well, I hope it works. I don't think it will, but I hope it works. There was just that attitude that the community was a scary thing. And it was for some of the people leaving, but the staff didn't think it would ever work. Very few. I met some later that began to understand it, and some that participated very, very involved in making sure it happened. But I think that attitude change is what really started things moving, where people really started to believe that and understand that you're 78 years old, you've lived at Polk Center for 60 some years, you still have self-abuse issues, but yet those can be dealt with in a smaller place. You can go to retirement community. You can leave your 16-bed unit and drive on a van somewhere and have a better or a more involved life. Once they believed it, then it was much easier to be able to see that through. And in every case, again, there were naysayers, so you had to address the issues that they brought forward, why the person they were felt that all their years of experience just address those issues. But again, it took some work to figure it out, but not, when I look at it in retrospect, it wasn't really that hard, but yet it took time. It was a time-consuming issue.
So can you talk about Christmas holiday and taking people home?
Yeah, well, I made an interesting observation when I was younger. Maybe I was smarter when I was younger. Here I'm going home for Christmas, and I got people in my group home. This is when I worked direct care in a group home who have nowhere to go. Interestingly, the one that came home with me for a lot of years with my family, his mother, his aunt told me his mom placed him at Polk Center when he was 5 and wanted nothing else to do. The family wanted nothing else to do with him. So here he is living in a group home in Erie. His aunt lives up the street. His aunt calls up and says, come up, I'll give you Christmas gifts for him. Well, here I can go home, take somebody with me, do it voluntarily so we don't violate any labor and industry laws about working and volunteerism. And the Barber Center was fine with that. But it for about 20 years at least, I would bring home one of the residents to our family. And we traveled. We never stayed in our own home. We traveled. Generally, it was about 100 miles. And again, as every holiday, I did that for those 20 years. And again, it was a no-brainer in my mind. It meant we had to drive 2 cars because I had 4 kids. I had David and all our stuff for holidays. But it was so much enriching to our family. My kids remember it. My kids have always then been involved in the disability movement by default for being around me. It touched my in-laws so much so that later they became life-sharing providers for the county they lived in. That county allowed 2 individuals per home. So for many years, they had 2 ladies living with them until their health became an issue. So it really, again, no one really questioned that David has Down syndrome and he lives in a group home. Family is David coming? What should we get David? What can we do? He had no teeth. You mentioned about teeth being pulled at Polk Center. When he came out, he had no teeth, and I was always amazed. How in the world you eat with your gums, anything, and he liked to eat. And so again, the holiday feast, you watch him enjoying simple things. He played harmonica, and so every year we bought him a harmonica. So the kids would quiet now. David's got to play his harmonica, right after he opens it. So for me, it just made it just brought it all together for my family and for us that here's a little thing that we do for David. And after I left, I became a supervisor of the group home and went on to bigger and bigger things. But I always tried to find where he was living at. The Barber Center eventually went to 4-bedroom group homes from 7 and 8. In the early years, it was 7, 8 group home or people per group home. So David moved to a completely different community where they didn't really want these people to live, but they worked through it. And I would go up and visit him in his new neighborhood, and none of his neighbors knew him. So I felt like, again, it's like, even though they're in a neighborhood, people are still a little fearful. This is the first time to have a group home. And I felt really good about going to visit him, get him, do things with him, just take him out. And so to me, it puts the humanity on that we're not just there to, collect a paycheck and go home at the end of the day and say, oh, do I have to go back tomorrow? No, it was really all about what we were trying to do with the people that lived there and make them part of that community. And I got lots of stories about making people part of the community because I really worked hard to do that. It was controversial in some ways at times because not everyone likes to see people have, I say, freedom. when you give people freedom, there's fears of what's going to happen. You let them go down the street to the neighborhood bar. What's going to happen? Well, the bar patrons who get to know them will bring them back without me having to walk down. I know that'll happen, and they all, so you just have to build over those fears. But regulation gets in the way a lot at times, or it used to get in the way. That no, someone who is in an ICFMR care cannot walk down the street by themselves unless they have a formal plan, and okay, the bar's 2 doors down. He's been doing it for 20 years. Now we are under ICFMR. So, okay, line of sight, perfect. I can look out the window and watch. So you work through those things. And again, I was happy that I always worked with people that saw it that way too. But not everybody does. And that's the hard part of community is that, we tend to lose. I think you said sometimes we don't remember what community is all about. And it's even getting worse in society these days. And so to integrate people into community when you don't even have a community sometimes can be a little more challenging until you remember what it's all about. So
I always think of the group homes when we would bring some people into them and they'd say things like, we'd learn that they smoke cigarettes. And, 20 years ago, that wasn't such an uncommon thing. And how do you accommodate this? And you have regulations and it's a home. It's, if you want to smoke. I mean, that doesn't, you have to work with your roommates, et cetera, but that's true in any family, right? And sometimes we wouldn't look at it that way. I wanted to comment, Randy, one of the things you said is you developed those plans. We talked a lot back then about person-centered planning because we were moving from programming to person. Instead of thinking about what bucket can we throw him in where we're done and we don't have to worry any longer, we started to look at people as individuals and what they're worth, what they wanted, and giving them value and worth, and it made a big difference, and it continues today. I mean, we use many of the same buzzwords, but we have a tendency to change things and make up new acronyms like any other field.
Well, the system has a built-in, made it harder. I am a 20-year-old, graduated from college. The next day I move into a group home, which I was familiar with because I worked there. 7 people living together, and then we weren't talking about individualized programming. 7 people, I was 1 to 7. Now it would be unheard of, to do that. But we were 1 to 7 going to the local pub regularly. We were 1 to 7 going out to eat. It just, again, it just challenged me more that I got to find a place. If we go out to dinner somewhere, it can't be the little neighborhood place that has 3 seats. It really, we have to think bigger, think differently. Interesting, I mentioned about David. The day he was dropped off at the group home is, again, instructional in my mind. He had moved from Polk Center at the Barber Center. They had residents, 43-bed unit where people came as to transition. So he was living there. They said, David, we got an opening. We're going to bring him out to see the group home. Literally dropped him off and left. David looked at me and scooted down West 26th Street in Erie, which is a major street. And I ran after him with a bag of cheese puffs or whatever. It was, David, do you want to have a snack? Come back. It worked. And I'm like, okay. Like me, he likes cheese puff. He likes food. Got him back, calm, sitting, and realized what a hard transition. 5 years old, I moved to an institution. And he folded clothes. He's the best folder I ever met in my life. He folded his clothes immaculately. Now you're at a new home, strange people. Maybe some from Polk Center. But just dropped, and the fear. And I felt that in my own heart. I'm like, yeah, I moved to Erie. I was a small town boy, and I'm up in Erie, and West 26th Street scares me at night when people are screaming and hollering. And that I could externalize or internalize that feeling he was having to what I was feeling like being new to a city. And I was like, that's why I guess I fell for David then. Like, here's a spirited fella that is going to be fun to have around and like to keep to himself. And he made that nonverbal also. So you couldn't have a conversation, but you could have a conversation in a different way. So.
We have a couple key questions that we wanted to get through with Randy again, just real quick. So,
Yep.
and I'll just talk about these and you can follow up. But this idea of sort of reunions with families from Polk. So, kind of the before and after, like, I guess sort of that, and how people felt after people left. Like, they got it. Like, when did that sort of epiphany happen for families that they were like, oh, it's working?
I think, when it started to work,
Right,
So,
right.
but,
So
yeah.
if you can talk just
Yeah,
a little bit
absolutely.
about that. So, but the first thing would be this idea of family reunions.
Yeah, I had a personal experience with a couple of those situations.
Yeah, if you could talk about that.
All right, so one of the things that was again, a lot of these interactions sometimes when were really hard, kind of broke my heart, but at the same time encouraged me. But one day, a knock on the door at the group home I worked at, David's brother showed up because he visited Erie from Oklahoma and saw his aunt up the street, and he said, "My aunt told me my brother David's alive." I said, "Oh," and he went on to say that when he was placed at Polk Center, his family told him his brother had died. And he was slightly younger than David, I believe, not much, but slightly younger. So all his life in Oklahoma, he was actually a Walmart manager long before I even heard of Walmart. He thought his brother had died. And so, again, well, we want to do something for David. What's he like? Get him a harmonica, get him snacks. You do this, do that. Has no teeth, So we're talking about that. He and his wife spent the day, just joy. I mean, pure joy. And I was like, oh wow, this is gonna be great. Now David wasn't so joyful in the sense of, like, who is this guy? He doesn't know who this guy. Who is this lady? Once they bought the harmonica and brought it, then he got the connection that this is somebody I want to take and be friends with or take notice of. But that lasted essentially a few hours during the day that they were there. They moved back to Oklahoma. Every year we would send something out to them, or once in a while they would call them. And the system is kind of weird in the sense that, all right, the brother was found. So now all the decision making about David goes through the brother who saw him for 7 hours on a certain date. And, even as David's health declined, he started to show signs of dementia, and decisions had to be made for him. I knew him better than the brother did, 20 some years plus, but the brother would be called and he never did come back to visit him. But I realized that, again, not so much David didn't embrace it so much, but that brother, the fact that I never understood anything about my brother dying. I didn't even know what Polk Center was, and to see that and work through that with a family. I was a counselor, going into counseling, so it was really kind of neat for me. But I saw that, I saw that whole embracement of, like David now is somebody that we want to know more about, at least for that time period. And that was very heartening for me to see that. One of the other guys in the group home, Leo, was similar type of thing. You ask how families sometimes felt about it. Leo came from a family that all the brothers were in the war. And he was slow learner. He was not intellectually disabled, I don't believe, by testing. I don't think they ever, but he at 16 got retinitis pigmentosa, which rendered him blind. And so they shipped him to Polk Center, where he stayed until he was 60 some years old. I forget whether he was 62, 65. But Leo was smart. He was slow by their definition, but smart by my definition. He took in everything at Polk Center, and he was a historian. Unfortunately, Leo has long been gone. But what I saw, his family was actually from my same county. I grew up in Elk County. And I ended up talking to his brother when I would take him over to talk, before holidays. His brother was like, we'd like Leo to come over just for the day, though. We don't have the accommodations. They were a drinking family, whiskey around, so I'd go over. I'm like, now I'm on duty. Remember this. I'm on duty. What you got to drink? You got to have a whiskey. Leo says, and his brother said, yeah, you got. But that family, again, all those years apart, they didn't visit Leo much. They didn't really, but once he was in the community and they knew that where he was at and that somebody would take him to them, they didn't come get him generally. They embraced him again. And it was just like they picked up where they left off, if they were a family together. Hey, the holidays are tradition. everybody drinks a shot of whiskey and we go on. So that was my experience with most families that saw people come out. Either they're totally standoffish, and a lot of families moved away. They moved to Florida, would check in, or they're very grateful. And I really never really felt any family member say their life was worse since they left. Anytime there was an issue, that wouldn't have happened at Polk Center. Well, they fell because they had a medical emergency. They would have fallen wherever. But in general, I think I only saw good things come from the people that left, and people being very grateful for it. Because they knew the difficulty of the care for their loved one, and knew that somebody was going out of their way to care for them. So I don't know if you had similar experiences with families.
Not to that extent, but I wasn't involved in the front line with families like you were.
So, Randy, you and your family have been life-sharing family for 25 years with Matthew, who joined your family at age 13 and is now 38.
Correct.
A life-sharing is a living arrangement in which a person with an intellectual disability shares a home and is supported by another person or family. What has life-sharing meant for your family?
Well, now it's, again, my kids were already well-versed growing up about what disability was, but in Matthew's situation, again, I like what you said about fixing things. Sometimes I like to fix things too, and I get in trouble with the regulations sometimes, but Matthew had left his home when he was age 8, and we were his 4th life-sharing family. About a year, and a lot of behavioral stuff, whatever. And so here was Matthew now failing, if you will, 2 weeks in inpatient mental health at a community hospital, and they're saying, "What's the plan? He's leaving. You got to have a plan." I was the ARC director at that point. What's the plan? I'm thinking, okay, gee, I could take care of Matthew in my own home and talk to the kids, the family about it, and so we agreed we'll do it. First night didn't go so well. Matthew likes to do things, but I also understood how to deal with behavior that, if you don't allow it to occur, you make sure there's some understands it can't happen. We do it. And still to this day, I have to remind him that when we go out to a family gathering, we just went out to a birthday party in Erie, went out to eat the whole way on the way home before we left as a family. We're going out to dinner. There's no swearing. There's no this. There's no that. If you do, I will take you and we will leave. That's the rule, because after 25 years. And the kids begin to appreciate it, because they know now what to anticipate too, and they're pretty good about doing it. But again, taking someone who has some difficult behaviors into your home always puts a stress on your family. There's no doubt about it. But my kids all embraced it. I mean, they've been happy with it. One of the things I thought might happen, I'm not sure it's going to, is now that my children have their own children, they're not as willing as I have been to want to do that in-home care. So my only concern for the future of Matthew is that some point I may not be able to do it. And I had expected that, and again, it's a bad expectation. You shouldn't expect that your children will take over necessarily. They help out, respite whenever I need it, that type of thing. But yeah, I mean, I always thought it was weird. Actually, Nancy Thaler, I always give her credit. I listened to everything Nancy Thaler said, who was the deputy secretary for the OMR, Office of Developmental Programs. She said, shouldn't we learn to walk the walk and talk the talk? And it's interesting that I got criticized. I'm the director of an agency, not for doing this. I have someone living in my home who was being served by the agency. So the conversation started coming up. That's a conflict of interest. Oh, how's it a conflict of interest? You explain it to me so I understand it. Back and forth, back and forth. I finally gave up arguing and moved his service. A separate agency oversees his services, which is fine. I'm no longer affiliated with the ARC. I retired. We could go back there, but we've been with that agency for a lot of years. So in some ways, I thought there was a time where the system was recognizing we got to do more than just be, we got to do more. We got to do more with trying to promote life sharing. And at one time in Crawford County, there were at least 50 people or 50 families that were doing life sharing. It was a big program, continues to be, because we had families that really were concerned, got to know folks, and wanted to see if this could be a possibility for them. So it challenges my family. It makes life more difficult sometimes. Here I'm in Pittsburgh. My wife's at home. His program ends at 3. She's got to be there at 3 for the person to drop them off. So but overall, I think it's given my kids an understanding. And actually, most of my daughter works in the field. She worked at the Arc in Anchorage, Alaska for many years and loved it. Still works part-time now with children. My son has worked in group homes and both sons have done that. So it's given them an understanding. And if I say I've recruited some good workers for the future, if they can't find a job ever with what they want to do, they always would consider working in the field because of seeing and understanding David, Matt, how we as a family cared for them. And they generally enjoy when they come home to visit, the fact that all the memories of Matthew, whether it's good and sometimes good, bad, or just funny moments. That's part of our whole family structure now. He's part of our life, and 25 years later, hard to believe it's 25. So
That brings to mind something, I noticed when I was in Altoona recently that there's a lot of life sharing in rural areas. Can you guys talk about that? Because we don't see it a lot in an urban setting.
I was a little surprised when you said that earlier because I don't remember what our census was 25 years ago, but it was not uncommon. And it was in some cases, it was similar to what Randy said. There were a number of people who had made a decision that they were going to be in this field for a living. And it was a very natural thing for them to do, to start to invite somebody to come over for dinner or to bring them home for Thanksgiving dinner because they were just going to sit in a group home or didn't have any family and relationships that develop, and they'd say, you know what, I think I'd like John to move in with me, or I think I'd like Betty to move in with me, and they would, and then they do, of course, after they did all of the proper procedural things to make sure that they were acceptable and things were put in place by the agency, and I'm sure it's true today. I haven't been involved at that level, but where, the home was subject to inspection and not just when they moved in, but I don't remember if it was annual or how often and different things to make sure that, but, and I think the stipends improved, but I still don't think anybody's doing it to get rich. They receive a stipend, but they probably, in many cases, don't even break even, to be honest with you. But I think some of that just comes from the nature of small town community. You have a tendency to help your neighbor more. I've lived outside of New York City, Columbus, Ohio, where, you didn't go know the guy in the apartment next door to you. And like I said, in Mercer County, I'm MJ's dad. Everybody knows my son. So, and I'm sure that's true up where you live.
Well, I think the beginning, because I was at the beginning of life sharing, and we'll call it family living. We never called it. We changed it because families said, you're paying somebody to care for my loved one in family living, and some objected to that, and even though they wanted them to move on to something different, so it became life sharing through family living. But the initial stipend difficulty of care was really small, at least in Crawford. It was $10,000. Everybody, no matter how complex your care, what I think has happened in rural communities is I'm not taking in this person just for a couple months. There's a lifelong commitment. And I think of a family that they've had a man. They were his foster parents. They became life sharing. And that sort of said, now it doesn't end at 21. He's 40 some years old. They have to get help in the home, which luckily the system provides to lift them out of bed at night in morning for morning care. They could not see anyone else caring for him in his life. And the chances are good another family that could take that person of level of care and do it, because he's a big, strapping young man. So I think in rural areas that a lot of times you had people who had relationships with their families or other people. And again, the small town relationships, it was all about, I want to do it. And I got to know them, and I don't plan. Economically, it has gotten better, and so some, in some families, it has been looked at as, hey, I can stay home and care, and some of the support systems that have come into play make it possible for a family to still have a life. The person goes to some sort of a day program, so it makes it easier to be able to do it. And but yeah, for a while, we had just tons of people scrambling. But we also had people scrambling that we would never approve to be life sharing providers.
Sure.
I remember a vivid call. I saw your ad in the paper. I never put an ad in again about wanting somebody to live in my home. I got a spare bedroom out back, and I'll be happy to have one of your people. And he used a slur, live there. So we realized that it's not about advertising and finding people. It's about creating relationships first, or identifying those. And that's how it was successful. There were a lot of relationships when we started looking. Wow, this person comes to take him to church, and he would like to live with that person. How can we make it happen? Or with that family? Life sharing, and it got better and better. And then actually, I would somewhat disagree with you a little bit. The reimbursement's gotten better with the new rates. I was shocked when even on retired.
I know it has, but
yeah.
I mean, you still
oh
aren't
yeah, you
getting
don't.
rates.
But those people have been doing it for all these years. If you give them a little extra money, they're already going to do it. I think it's just so respectful
Right,
of them
right.
to know that, hey, you've done this all for 20 years, 25 years. So I went like, that was an omelet. What? That's going to be the new rate? That's actually, I immediately wrote the agency. It says, I see you're going to get a lot of extra money here. What are you going to do for Matthew? How can you help our family? And they were, to their credit, they started talking to me about things, and I was really happy with that.
I think my favorite life sharing story was I got a call just a few years ago. Somebody had been given my name because of my involvement with the Arc of the U.S., and it was a family in Mercer County, and they had an individual with them. I never met the family or the individual, but they'd had him with them for a number of years, and the family had to move to Virginia for work. Well, anybody who's been around knows that the way the funding stream doesn't cross state lines, because and that's a whole nother discussion. But they knew that I probably knew some people in Virginia, so, and that's what I did. I called the Arc of Northern Virginia, because I'd had good experience with them, with their allowing self advocates to be involved, and I'm not sure if they landed with a chapter of the Arc as a provider, but they made the Arc helped them navigate the Virginia system so that the care continued. Reimbursement might not have for the entire time, but it eventually was picked back up. And I just thought that was so cool that, they're getting ready to leave. And not only are they worried about what school are my kids going to be in and where do we want to leave,
Sure.
we've got this adult man who has grown up with my children with an intellectual disability, and he's part of our family. He's going with us. I never did get to meet the family. I would have loved to, but that wasn't what was important. And I just think the life sharing opportunities are fantastic.
I agree. Very cool. So, MJ, as a board member and as an officer of the ARC at the local, state, and national level, you've helped ensure that the organizations are operating at a high level so they can do their important work. You've said that your faith drives your efforts, that you are called to serve, and that your son MJ was the catalyst for where you chose to serve. Can you elaborate?
When my son was born, my ex-wife and I got married relatively late in life. When my son was born, I was 36 years old. She was 33, which is, relatively old for a first child. And we had no idea that our son had a disability. And about 12 hours after his birth, the head of pediatrics at Sharon Regional told us, we strongly suspect that your son has Down syndrome. And there were enough physical indicators that they were 99% sure. And I had grown up and would have called myself a Christian. I wouldn't say that we were active churchgoers. If the weather was nice out, we were probably camping. Or if it was too rotten out, we were just not going out. But, we grew up like a lot of people who grew up in this, were born in the 50s and 60s, the baby boomer generation. That was just part of our life. But I remember holding my son and looking at him and realizing what I was facing. I had had experience with people with intellectual disabilities in a work environment, a job I'd had previously. I'd had some experience even with an institutional environment, the old Youngstown Developmental Center. It was a small institution in Youngstown, Ohio, just over the state line. And I remember thinking, how is this in your image, Lord? He's broken and rejecting God. And I found myself in a real funk and in a real dark place that I shouldn't have been in. But my wife and I at that time had been married less than a year. And we had decided, we both, even though we weren't active churchgoers, thought that this is something that you should do, raising a kid. And I had a great pastor, and the guy was a lot smarter than I realized at the time. He kind of led me along. But I remember sitting with him, and I can't tell you how many times we talked, but him, asking him questions, how does this happen, so on, and him saying, I don't have the answer, but maybe we can figure it out. Well, of course, he had his scriptural take on it. But long story short, after a few months of talking together and him giving me passages of the Bible to read, and I'd read the Bible before, and I couldn't stand it, the language and everything else. So I don't know if any of you ever read the Living Bible. It was a Bible that was popular in the 70s, and it was kind of a paraphrase. It didn't, there were no these and thous and any of that. But he gave me a copy of that, and I remember one day we were talking about Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus, Ephesians 2, in particular, chapter 2, verses 8, 9, and 10. Because one of my concerns was I'd always heard that for my son to be saved, he had to proclaim Jesus as his Lord and Savior. And I'm like, how's a kid who, I don't know if he'll ever talk, read any of this going to do that? Well, lo and behold, Trumbo knew right, Reverend Trumbo was his name, knew right where he was leading me. And those verses say, in short, that you aren't saved by works. It's nothing you do. It's by faith. But God prepares good works in advance for you to do. And that just, I felt like the weight of the world went off of my shoulders. And I said something to Trumbo about verse 10, God prepares good works in advance for you to do. And he looked at me and he said, did you ever think that your son was your ministry? And that opened my eyes. And as I said, I volunteered with the local chapter of the Arc, and whenever something would come up that they would need help with, whether it was fundraising or, in my case, I helped with quite a bit with some difficult issues over the years in terms of position statements and things like that. I think Randy will remember when I was with the Arc of PA, we were kind of in the middle of seemed like every day there was a new storm brewing because of the changes that were just happening to the system at the time as we moved into a person-centered and started to give the folks we served a voice. So that continues to drive me. I believe in the value of all life. I don't think that my life is worth any more than any other human, regardless of ability or or disability, and I think that's I think it's an issue we're dealing with again in society, but it's a cyclical thing that I think we go through, and I'll continue to advocate for the civil rights of people, and in particular people with disabilities.
So, Randy, you've said that your years of working with people with disabilities has shown you that it does not take all that much to help someone thrive. Just offer opportunity, you have said. Can you
Yeah.
elaborate?
Well, again, it's like I said that when I started the field, I was like, the field of intellectual disability, can it possibly be that much of a learning type of thing? But yet, there were so many changes, there were so many debates, all these things. But when I started to look back at it, I still am involved in kind of a different way. I don't do direct service necessarily. I mean, I do life sharing. I'm guardian of several individuals for the courts. But what I realized, even with something like that, I'm the guardian of two people and power of attorney of a third. That doesn't mean I have to take away their voice. I don't have to take away. All I have to do is be the guy that is somewhat balanced to say, well, let's hear what they want to say. Let's give them this opportunity. I support it as their guardian to try. And we know that there could be some issues. We identify those issues. So I guess that was the thing that all throughout my career I kept realizing is that there's so many obstacles put into place of people with disabilities. The society says you can't do it. People, even within the field, say you can't do it. All we really need to do is sort of open the door and give them a chance and start to look at it. And so, like, I was at the beginning of the life skills program, now community rehabilitation, whatever but that's what that was all about, was that you don't know what's out there because you've never been given a chance. So all we need to do is figure out how we give you a chance. How do we give you a chance to go be part of your community, to volunteer, to pursue an employment opportunity? And honestly, the answer was pretty simple. We just need to create a little bit of an infrastructure. And the last I knew, at least the Arc of Crawford County, the life skills program was booming. We couldn't find enough staff to be able to support the number of people that wanted it. It just as an interest. And so again, we started focusing. I always liked the person-centered. That was choice. All these words, but it always made sense to me that if we focus on the individual, it's what they want, and not always what they say, but what they observe them and see what they like, and really use that as our guide. We'll go a lot further in life. And to me, that was like, in retrospect, you look at that, wow, that was like a wow, moment, that it wasn't really that hard, but it was hard to come to that conclusion. And it took a lot of different, incarnations of different ways
Sure.
of looking at things before we actually got there. And again, sometimes parents, I hate to say it, MJ, sometimes parents were an impediment to that, especially older
Absolutely.
parents. You see that older parents were protective. And I always use a story to represent that. We had a board member, beautiful woman. I loved her and her son and her husband that were part of the ARC movement. And I started talking about, now it's probably time that we need to start introducing some level of sexuality into our education. These are now adults. And she looked at me and smiled politely. Randy, that is the best idea, but don't include Johnny in that program. And I learned from that is that, we have to help the parent to allow. And so again, it's in some ways it's simple. Just opening the door, letting them have a little bit of freedom to learn, and us supporting that, knowing that it doesn't matter if you choose you didn't like it. You don't need to feel bad. You thought you wanted to be, a mechanic down at the local garage, and we get you down there, and you realize, no, it's work, and I don't want to do it. It's okay. And so it just that I think that started guiding me a lot more throughout my career. And unfortunately, there are times where being an administrator, that becomes hard. Not for me to expect, but the regulations sometimes try to prevent good things like that from happening. And I get frustrated. I don't want to be a paper pushing son of a gun. I want to be out there on the floor with people and experiencing their lives and helping them. So
I think you call it life skills in
Mhm.
Crawford County, but it's a habilitation aid program, and that's primarily the service I've secured for my son. And my son goes out in the community and he experiences things, and we're working on some skills that are very simple life skills. some I would argue are even pre-vocational skills. He goes to a facility, but he doesn't spend time at it, just to pick up their laundry. And he and a hab aide go to the laundromat, and he sorts and shoves it in the washer, and nothing makes him happier than putting quarters in a machine and seeing something happen. He doesn't care what it is that happened, just something, he's not interested in winning prizes. He's interested in that. So, it's great. And like I said, he's out in the community, and it's been a wonderful thing. And it gives him a chance to be loved and to love. So.
Well, thank you. This has been incredible and instructive,
welcome.
and just terrific to watch both of your stories intersect and work in parallel. It's
Sure.
really exciting.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just want to be clear. I was never one of those problem parents.
This interview was recorded on December 7, 2018 at Studio Me, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Interviewer was Mary Hartley. Videographers were Ryan Haggerty and Matthew Thornton. Interview with Randy Gorske of Crawford County and M.J. Bartelmay of Mercer County, disability rights leaders. The Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium expresses sincere appreciation to M.J. Bartelmay, Randy Gorske, Senator John Hines History Center, Edith L. Trees Charitable Trust, FISA Foundation, Achieva, Institute on Disabilities at Temple University. This interview is a production of the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium. The logo of the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium shows the map of Pennsylvania. The counties in the western half of the state are highlighted. To learn more about disability history in Western Pennsylvania, visit www.wpdhac.org. Copyright Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium, 2020, all rights reserved.